While we're waiting for folks to join, feel free to put your name on the attendees list. And also, if there's any things you wanted to add onto the agenda, feel free to add it on. I know that originally Kim was going to give a demo on, or not a demo, a presentation on some of the SLSA conformance work. So some of the stuff that we were going to talk about regarding like how can people sort of assert that they are SLSA, both from a third party has audited you, as well as sort of a self assertion that yes, we are compliant with SLSA. But she is going to be out today, so that's going to be probably pushed back till next meeting, just so you, just FYI. All right, we're about 4 minutes in, so we can get started here. So just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube a little bit after this meeting ends. And also your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. Okay, so before we get started on the agenda, is there anybody who is new to this meeting who wants to maybe introduce themselves?
Hey, hi, this is Dixon. So I'll be joining Palo Alto Networks as a security engineer, stuff on cloud security. So I've been in cloud security for DevOps and cloud security for like 6.5 years. So been in this DevOps world as well as security world from last 6.5 years.
Cool. Anybody else? Oh, okay, so we can get into the agenda. So I know before maybe we go into the updates, I know there's a couple of quick notes regarding something's the Microsoft sort of SSC stuff. I don't know who's on from that end, or if David, you're giving an update on that. Oh, I see Jay's on. Jay, do you want to kind of give just a little intro there?
Sure, absolutely. So we've been going around to the different working groups in proposal and the pitch of our open source software supply chain security framework. That's a more consumer focused framework. And the way that we've been pitching this is in bridge and in parallel with SLSA. I've done so in an effort to not bring them together early on. When I've had these conversations, I've always said, taking this consumer focused framework and then maybe bridging it with a more producer focused framework. But now I'm being extremely specific because I see where the bridge, I see where the parallel is, and I really do feel like both of these frameworks together SLSA in its scope, the SSC in its scope, bridging them together, working on them in parallel, working on them in the open, and both being members of the OpenSSF towards standardization. And you know, David Wheeler can discuss this more specifically because there is a pathway, but the aspiration is to have both of these documents. Can you imagine an ISO-1 and -2 for a complete secure supply chain framework that's internationally recognized within the industry? So that's aspirational. But the idea to bring it here to this, and of course, I've been in these meetings. I'm active in them. This meeting, the positioning, tooling, and specification meetings. So I'm all about SLSA as well because I see the potential of both of these frameworks together. The idea is bring it in, have the discussion here, bring the discussion to the specification SIG, bring the discussion to the positioning SIG, so that both of these frameworks can be worked in tandem because they both bridge, they both balance off of one another, and they both have bridges to one another, and we can all make these documents collectively successful. Yeah, I would love to further the discussion here as a heightened agenda item for one of these meetings on a bi-weekly, and then of course bring it into the SIG meetings to carry on discussions there on how these can be positioned together and how they can be worked together specification wise and of course tooling wise.
Great, thank you. I have added some notes and I also added the URL so you can see, everybody can see the current draft. So, Jay, thank you.
We'll take any questions if there are any.
Just to jump in with a question, Jay, can you tell us a little bit about, I think I caught that you mentioned that you guys have looked at the parallels between that and SLSA. Are you able to comment on that at all for us, just to give some color?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we consider, and this is of course high level talking, I usually leave the detail and everything regarding it to Adrian. He's not in this card now. He has a conflict. But at high level, when we consider security versus compliance, you have compliance, you have attestations, you have potential third-party certification, you have an accreditation situation, a potential accreditation body. But then when you get down into the nuts and bolts of how controls are applied and what those controls are versus the requirements that the controls need to fit into, now you're thinking about how do we take what we want to do supply chain security wise, have a compliance structure, but then have that security framework underneath it. You go end to end and you take in from ingestion, which is consumer focused, and now you're on the other end, the build end, on the producer focused, and you take these two frameworks and work towards the middle, right? So when we talk about bridging, when I refer to that and say, there are gaps in SLSA that we talk about in all of these meetings. And a lot of the conversation that we have around these gaps are actually scope creep to what SLSA is originally intended for. That's because we recognize that the gaps in SLSA really do live on the consumption side of things. If we take this SSC framework and we dissect it the same way, we find the same gaps. And the gaps that we find on that really do live on the producer side of things. You see where I'm going? So when I understand what the gaps are and we realize what the deltas are, in terms of filling these gaps, we can clearly see where one can complement the other. And instead of us working on them separately, and these don't work against one another. they complement one another very well. And this is not in competition. If we drive them together and we have both in mind, as I said before, how beautiful would it be an ISO-1 and ISO-2? And the -3 for the tooling. I shrug. David, I added that in just now. That was off top of the head just now. I added it in. A -3 for the tooling. I shrug. I don't. Jesus.
Cool. So are there any other sort of questions there? So I know, Jay, you've given a bunch of presentations now on this, and actually one of the things that might be useful is, because I don't want to have to say, hey, next time we do this, you should give the same presentation again. We should probably forward folks the YouTube video of one of the previous meetings here. But I know we wanted to kind of, I know you wanted to sort of bring this up to folks so that folks sort of understand where this is going, as well as also, you know, making it clear here, right? Like SLSA has a specific scope. There are other things that are sort of broader than that scope, and there are things that are focused on other things. And so, yeah, just wanted to, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, cool. So moving on to now, let me just see here. Yeah, the updates on from the SIGs here. First up is the specification SIG.
Hey, so we had 2 weeks off due to the holiday, but we met last week or this week. We basically agreed to the high level kind of major decisions for the 1.0 proposal. I'll say right now, the next step is actually to write up the actual draft and get that reviewed. And so I wouldn't count like any of these as like set in stone per se. Like we'll see what it actually looks like in a draft and make sure it looks good before we actually ratify it. But the things that we discussed at length in the SIG were, one, to split a recap. We talked about some of these previously, but I want to recap it kind of in one chunk. One is to split up into build versus source levels rather than having a single 1, 2, 3, 4. There's like build 1, 2, 3, 4, source. I don't know what the numbers are going to be for various reasons that we could explain, or you could read in the doc if you want. A second is to postpone the definition of SLSA 4, which is now SLSA build level 4, which is the 2-party review requirement on the source side and hermetic builds. I think that's the main thing on the build side. Postpone the definition until after the 1.0 release, because there's a lot of questions around hermetic builds. And so we'll, instead of blocking 1.0 on that, we'll defer it. We'll still have some sort of note that says like, these things are coming down the road for a future level. We just won't set it in stone. And speaking of setting in stone, one thing that we decided was that the names of like SLSA build level 1, build level 2, etc. Will, once we do 1.0, will be basically immutable. And the reason for this is like the high level gist. We could like tweak it and have like small requirements, but the basic thing of like, what does build level 3 mean will stay the same. And the reason is because if we start changing it between versions, it gets very confusing when two people are talking about I'm SLSA build level 3, when they're not actually meaning the same thing. Yes, you could include version numbers, but when people discuss informally, they just naturally drop the version numbers because it's too difficult to say build level 3 version 1. And so it's more desirable if we ever have to do a major refactoring where the gist changes, we'll just use a different name to avoid confusion. Another major change is to add a requirement around documentation of evidence of security claims. And this is a replacement for the common requirements. Right now, there's this undefined set of common requirements at the bottom that are kind of like, you should do security and 2-party reviews, but that's about all we say. We'll replace that to a set of guidelines that suggest what to do without being like hard checks, and then have a requirement around having a detailed set of like designs and other evidence that why should anyone trust that you actually are meeting all these other requirements? Like, how do you know that builds are actually isolated? How is the service actually designed and implemented and run such that we know that, for example, employees at the company don't have access to tamper with it? How do we know that the two different builds are properly isolated from each other, and to what degree? And so having that in some sort of structured template is, we believe, is like a compromise, as opposed to like a hard check of like a bunch of check boxes, which we don't think are really realistic to cover all bases. And then the final main decision is to add, we need a better term for this, and hopefully we'll figure that out during development, is policy or verification or checks or whatever we call it. I think each of these terms has a problem because different people have a different idea of what that term means. And so I'm being really hesitant to say just policy, which is what the term I've always used for that. But we want to introduce that somehow because, like, as we had a presentation earlier from Vita, it's necessary in order to achieve the objectives and address the threats in SLSA. But it's not exactly clear yet how to work it into the specification. Like, does this become yet another line item in the requirements? Is it like an orthogonal property? Instead of doing that as part of the working group, it seems like it's best to just actually put it in a draft, see what it looks like, and then we could kind of review it from there. Because talking about it in the abstract, I think is too difficult. And so the next step is to take these ideas, in addition to like the list in GitHub of the actual things that we want to address in the requirements, and then just start iterating on that, make a draft and publish a draft at some other domain or some other URL, so that way people can start to view what the draft is and contribute to that. And then the proposed plan is to do that without necessarily code review of every single commit, and then review the whole thing in bulk, because like kind of individual PR changes don't really work for like a big document like this. We might then split it up into manageable chunks to review, but the initial development will be able to view like a kind of like an unpublished draft. That's the main, I think that's the main piece out of the specification. Am I missing anything, anyone? Yeah, I think that's it. So anyone from positioning here? I know Melba is not attending.
Yeah, I think Melba is, at least she had mentioned that she wasn't feeling very well.
Yeah, and also I missed the last two meetings because I was on vacation.
Yeah.
So I have to catch up with Melba.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit towards that, which is there was some discussion about stuff like SLSA conformance, and what sorts of things can folks do to sort of like how are we how are different folks going to be providing like the information out there. There was some discussion about sort of continuous compliance and that sort of thing. The other stuff was how will claims that are external to SLSA, like for example a VEX or something like that, how will everything sort of refer to each other, and what generally how should people be viewing like different elements of like, hey, I have a SLSA attestation, how does that fit into my bigger picture, kind of related to some of what Jay was talking about just prior with the SSC stuff. There was talk about maybe setting up some like a recurring blog articles, especially something like, and I know this is some of the stuff that was also discussed potentially about the adoption piece as we kind of drive towards adoption as well, as like, hey, can we start having regular blog articles, maybe even weekly blog series that just talks about stuff like how to implement SLSA, how to get started, and you know, that sort of thing, and drive almost like from a marketing perspective as well of like, hey, if there's a new SLSA blog article every week, then people are like, oh, okay, cool, it stays in people's minds, that sort of thing. There was some discussion as well about integrating with OzCal, and like, are there things that we can do from a mapping perspective of with existing sorts of standards that are out there, so that people who are maybe already using an existing standard, if it's already hitting the requirements from SLSA, they can see that like, oh, I'm actually already SLSA compliant. I just need to generate SLSA provenance now. There's stuff on that end. I see that John from the CNCF controls group is on. And so one of the things that's also been brought up is how we can all sort of better collaborate. The one big problem is that the SLSA positioning meeting happens to be at the same time as the CNCF security tag controls meeting is. So we've been trying to figure out maybe some out of band stuff on that front to try and kind of you know, integrate there. And then we're also looking to sort of work with some of the other groups like the SBOM groups and so on how we can better sort of collaborate and make sure that it's clear, you know, hey, here's the SLSA scope, here's what SBOMs are doing, and make sure that folks better understand that. Because I know one of the big things that's been very, very confusing for folks is like, where does SLSA start and end? Where does, you know, for example, SSC start and end? Where does SBOM start and end, and so on? So that and to be clear, I wasn't here last week for the SLSA positioning meeting, but that was kind of from the last few weeks and having the conversations, a few out of band conversations with Melda.
Yeah, I was there at the positioning meeting, and then Michael, you hit the nail on the head with a lot of that stuff. As a matter of fact, you know, we discussed a final review of the charter as well, but the OSCA stuff was huge in that meeting. Also, making sure that we're creating a SLSA JSON XML definition file that could be used to see if we can't use that kind of stuff to cross-reference whatever's going on in OSCal. And I believe there's a due out on that to see if they have an SSDF OSCal file, or plan to have one, something that could be mapped, one way or the other. There was discussion of a blog series of some sort. You know, and of course I'm on the hook for some development type stuff, right? So that we had development build, and then you know, going into further about publishing artifacts, and then continuous compliance and what the outline of those things look like. But that's I mean, that was the total that came out. I think that came out of that meeting. So yeah, you're not far off. It's just a continuation of a lot of the stuff that we discussed as well.
Cool. Okay, any questions about anything that positioning is working on? Otherwise we can move on to tooling. All right. Okay, I can talk about tooling. So the tooling working group has been focused on, so based on, you know, just to kind of give a little bit of the rundown, you know, we had categorized a bunch of the different SLSA tools where they are at this point in time. We just, you know, we had you know, we got consensus that generally the attestation distribution and discovery is where we wanted to focus most of our efforts. There's a ton of different folks who are building tools regarding the generation of attestations, right? So in fact, actually one of the things that's probably worthwhile to just sort of bring up, and it's in the SLSA Slack, both the tooling Slack as well as the general Slack, which is somebody from Samsung has written a Salsa Jenkins generator. They want to contribute it to the Salsa group. I don't know exactly how we want to handle that, as taking that on or whatever. But they brought that up. I think that also, and I want to put a pin in that as something just to kind of highlight, which is it does sound like there's more and more folks who are in sort of the different areas of Europe and Asia that this is a very bad time for them, that are starting to do a lot of stuff on the Salsa end. So we might want to just have some sort of discussion about, should we also have some sort of other time zone friendly meeting, something just to kind of consider. But anyway, for the tooling pieces, the things that we have been very much focused on is the sort of distribution and discovery. We have a bunch of notes that we've been writing up here, and I posted that in the chat here. So one of the big ones is OCI. So OCI recently merged in some changes to the distribution and image spec that allows us to now better sort of have actually a type in the OCI manifest, where you can say something like, this is a Salsa type. And so it makes it very easy to know, like, you can pretty much query before even checking the attestation. You can sort of make a query like, does this image have an attestation in the OCI registry correlated with it? And you can look in the thing and say, well, if I see a Salsa type, then I know it exists. And then you can then check it and so on. And then there's stuff around like something called the refers API, which allows us to potentially say this attestation potentially refers to something else in the registry. And there's a lot of interesting work on that end. The OCI folks want us to sort of have a chat about maybe making a Salsa predicate or in toto attestation type be an IANA official type. John?
Yeah, I just had a quick clarifying question. Those updates, are those actually in releases of the OCI spec, or?
So it was merged. It hasn't been officially released yet. So it is going to be released. They just haven't finished the release yet. And then the other thing is, once the spec itself is released, then the tools themselves have to implement the spec. So it could be a little bit of time before that's done, but it helps at least build consensus there. For folks who are not super familiar, the thing today is most of the tools today that are pushing out to OCI, they're using tools like things like Sigstore. And what they're doing is they more or less just say, I'm putting a blob into the OCI registry, and that blob is called the digest of the thing it refers to .att. And that's kind of the thing. But that has a lot of issues with it, because it becomes harder to kind of say, well, could you have multiple Salsa attestations that point to the same thing? For example, repeatable or reproducible builds? Not really. And it leads to a bunch of other issues. This sort of helps solve a lot of that. It also helps solve the thing of, if you sort of mirror if you mirror other images, you can essentially say, okay, cool, when I mirror this image, I also want to pull down all of these other things that are associated with it, and let you kind of pull all of that into your local registry without needing to know, okay, I need to see if there's an SBOM, if there's a this, if there's a that. All of that sort of stuff would get pulled in. So that's some stuff that we are sort of getting prepared for. Separately, we had a couple of conversations about attestation discovery. So these are things like, hey, as folks are looking at different tools, different libraries, different pieces of software, one of the big questions is, before I even download this piece of software, does it have a Salsa attestation? If it does have a Salsa attestation, does its dependencies have Salsa attestations, and so on? So there's some talk about, eventually, creating databases and things like that can store at least additional things for Salsa attestations that can then be queried, so that people can kind of find out, hey, has somebody like has a third party made a SLSA attestation about this, even if the primary hasn't, right? Things like that, and that's some stuff that's happening in the open source space with Guac, which I'm working on, and some of the other folks are working on. But it's something that we are interested in seeing if anybody else has other things that they're potentially working on, hey, how are people thinking about, now that we have all these SLSA attestations, correlating it with other metadata like SBOMs and so on to make decisions. And then finally, one of the other big things that's being sort of talked through is sort of general protocols for, or processes, I should say, for how people should be distributing SLSA attestations when it's not a core integration into the tool. So as an example, we have npm, Python, PyPI, Ruby gems, and so on. And some of those tools are looking to integrate stuff like SigStore and similar into the tools themselves. So as an example, one of the things that could happen is when you run npm install, it can go and say, okay, check, is there a SLSA attestation? If there is a SLSA attestation associated with, pull it down, yada, yada. Now, there's a lot of open questions about maybe building some patterns for how generally this should be implemented, because it just, from just a general good practices perspective. And then separately, one of the things that is also being talked about is for folks who that integration is not necessarily a possibility yet. Are there things that people can do that are like common practices to still sort of pull down these, attestations? So as an example, SLSA attestations are often, if they're constructed as files, they're often as JSON lines, because that's the standard in Intodo. And JSON lines files, which is a schema type. And so are there good things that we can suggest as the SLSA team saying, hey, this is what it should look like from the perspective of like, let's just say, for example, GitHub, right? You have your stuff, you have your release in GitHub, and the file should live alongside that release, or maybe it is packaged in the tarball or whatever. But those are some things that we are starting to sort of talk through, so that, some of the common tooling that is out of band from the actual package installation, right, for things that either don't meet an actual package installation, like, hey, this is just a tarball release, but we have an attestation associated with that tarball release. This is how you would check it, and have some general tooling for that, as well as helping folks out who are building tooling to say, oh, here's some general ways that we should do this, and how these attestations will probably be published and be associated with whatever the artifact is attesting. So that's the what we've been working on the tooling side. Questions? Cool. So that's it from the tooling side. Was there anything else on the agenda? I don't see anything else on the agenda. Does anybody else have anything else they wanted to bring up? Otherwise, we can end it early. All right. Well, everybody can have back 25 minutes or so, and see you all either at one of the SIG meetings or in 2 weeks.
Bye, everyone.
Later.